He always failed everybody anyway, but he liked to be mean about it. Finnegan, he called. Present. Bloom, present. Farwicker, present. John, present. The professor looked up from his roll book. You have a cold? John nodded miserably. Good. And on he went, calling the roll. When it was over, he pounded his head against the wall. Silence! He cried. I have a new rule to tell you. The students whipped out notebooks and filing cards. Starting today, any student who comes to class with a cold will automatically fail. Do you understand? Students nodded. And now I will give you a small exercise in logic. Premise. Students with colds fail this course. Statement of fact. John has a cold. Ergo what? Ergo, John fails, the class shouted. Q.E.D., replied the professor. Quod erat demonstrandum. That which was to be shown. Well done, class. And he happily swallowed 2 test tubes and a Bunsen burner. John fails. And he laughed, and his laughter was like the sound of turtles being crushed under falling palm trees. A sound nearly impossible to describe. A horrible sound. An unforgettable sound. The class shuddered. John fails. John will never be a scientist. Go, John, and starve. For he hated John. Kerchoo! Replied John in the saddest tone imaginable, for he didn't especially want to starve. Starving may be a valuable habit for artists, but scientists need lots of food to cover up the liquor on their breath. Scientists are nearly always drunk, which explains many of the strange things they do. He got up sadly from his stool and walked slowly from the room. He looked hungry already. "Now," shouted the professor, "that is the end of John," and he laughed again. This time his laughter was like the sound of ships sinking, and all the students looked down at their notebooks and trembled. "Out with your microscopes!" cried the old and evil professor. "Quickly!" He rushed up and down the aisles of the lab as the students whisked their microscopes from the locker and set them up on the tables. "Faster!" he screeched, whirling wildly around. The tail of his tuxedo — he always wore evening clothes when plotting evil — whisked out and knocked 2 microscopes to the floor, and he leaped on them and ground them to bent brass and broken glass beneath his evil heels. "Clumsy!" he shouted to the 2 nearest students. "You fail!" And he leaped to the front of the room and screamed for silence. "Silence!" he screamed, and the class was silent. You could hear John's unhappy footsteps crossing the campus outside, heading for the edge of the high cliff on which the old and famous university stood, for it was the custom for students to fling themselves over this precipice whenever they failed, which was pretty often. "Histology!" shouted the professor. "Today we study histology. A small quiz first. What is histology?" And he pointed his evil forefinger at a terrified co-ed who fainted. "Wrong!" he cried. "Histology is the study of tissues." And he failed her. "Somebody bring her to. Here, pour this on her." He gave one of the students a flask full of colorless liquid. "Don't get any on the floor," he said. But the girl had already recovered and fled from the room. Then the professor stood quietly in front of the room and smiled at the class. Seeing his smile, the class shifted uneasily, for the professor never smiled unless he was happy, and nothing made him happy except the knowledge that he had some evil plan up his wrinkled sleeve. He smiled such a smile that 3 frogs, seeing it from the specimen tank, leaped 7 feet into the air and fell dead. 2 windows cracked and shattered, and a pig embryo floating in a jar of alcohol turned bright green and sank to the bottom. It was not a nice smile. "Next question," he said. "What are the smallest cells in a human body?" Trembling, the students slipped underneath the tables, for nobody knew the answer. They looked fearfully at one another, for the professor used to occasionally dissect a student who failed to properly answer. "I'll split you like an infinity."